Her husband was killed, and she was in danger, but this police canine dog refused to leave her side. When Valerie's detective husband is murdered under suspicious circumstances, she discovers a hidden trail of evidence exposing police corruption. As threats close in, only her late husband's loyal police canine, Trooper, stands between her and those who want her silenced. With danger at every turn, can she uncover the truth before it's too late? Valerie Hayes sat in her quiet, dimly lit living room, holding her 6-month-old daughter, Isla, close to her chest. The soft sound of the ceiling fan barely filled the heavy silence that had taken over the house since Marcus's funeral. She was still getting used to it. The missing sound of his voice, the silence in the hallway where his footsteps used to be, the emptiness of their bed. No matter how much time passed, the loneliness never seemed to fade. Islam moved against her, her tiny face wrinkling before letting out a soft cry. Valerie kissed her forehead and gently rocked her, speaking soft words of comfort that even she didn't believe. She wished Marcus were here. He had always been the steady one, the calm presence in their lives. Now, it was just her, and every day felt harder than the last. A knock at the door made Valerie stiffen. She paused before standing, shifting Isla in her arms as she walked over and opened it. Outside stood 2 familiar faces, Sergeant Paul Grant and Officer Jenna Morales from her department. They gave her small, kind smiles. "Hey, Val," Paul said, his voice softer than usual. "Just wanted to check in on you." Valerie forced a small smile. "You guys didn't have to do that." "We know," Jenna said, looking at Isla warmly. "But we wanted to, and we brought something for you." Paul stepped aside, revealing a large German shepherd sitting calmly at his side. Valerie's breath caught in her throat. "Trooper." The dog's ears lifted, and his deep brown eyes met hers with a knowing look. His tail wagged slightly, but he didn't move, just watched her. Valerie gulped, her throat getting tighter. "We thought he should be with you," Jenna said gently. "Marcus would have wanted that." Valerie took an unsteady breath. Trooper had been Marcus's partner for years, a loyal and highly trained canine who had saved his life more than once. The idea of having him here, Marcus's dog, a living reminder of what she had lost, felt like too much to handle. I don't know if I can do this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't even take care of myself, let alone a retired police dog." Paul and Jenna exchanged a look before Paul spoke. "Val, we're not asking you to train him or put him to work. He's family, and he needs you as much as you need him." Valerie looked at Trooper again. He didn't move, just sat calmly, waiting for her decision. She let out a slow breath and stepped aside. "Come in." Paul gave Trooper a quick command, and the dog walked into the house, his nails tapping softly against the hardwood floor. He sniffed the air, taking in the familiar but now much quieter space. "His gear's in the car," Jenna said. "We'll bring it in before we go. If you need anything, you know where to find us." Valerie nodded, barely realizing what they were saying as they went to retrieve Trooper's things. When they left, the silence felt even heavier. Trooper stood a few feet away, leaning his head slightly as he studied her. Isla let out a soft baby sound, reaching her tiny hand toward him. Trooper took a careful step forward, sniffing at her reaching fingers. Valerie's chest tightened as she watched. Trooper had always been gentle around Marcus, and now, with Isla, he was the same, careful, calm, watchful. But Valerie wasn't ready for this. She turned away, setting Isla down in her baby bed. "You can stay," she said quietly, avoiding Trooper's gaze. "But don't expect anything from me." She walked away, leaving the dog standing alone in the living room. The next few days mixed into one. Valerie stuck to her routine, caring for Isla, keeping the house in order, preparing to go back to work. She avoided Trooper as much as she could, only noticing him when necessary. He never pushed. He simply watched her from a distance, quiet and patient. She knew he could tell something was wrong. He had always been good at picking up on feelings, trained to notice even the smallest signs. But she refused to let herself give in. She couldn't afford to. One evening, as she sat on the couch with Isla resting against her, Trooper approached. He moved slowly, carefully, then lay down beside her, his large head resting near her leg. He didn't push her or try to get attention. He just stayed there, close but giving her space. Valerie's fingers twitched. She wanted to reach out, to run her hands through his fluffy coat like she used to when Marcus came home, Trooper always right beside him. But the memories were too painful. Late that night, Valerie woke to a strange noise. She sat up in bed, listening carefully. At first, there was only silence, but then she heard it again, a soft creak like a door shifting slightly on its hinges. Her heart pounded as she turned to check on Isla, who was still sleeping soundly in her crib. Trooper, who had been lying at the foot of the bed, was already alert. His ears were perked up, and his body was tense. Then, he let out a low, rumbling growl. Valerie swallowed hard. She climbed out of bed and moved cautiously to the hallway. The front door was closed, but something felt off. She double-checked the locks, then turned toward Marcus's old office. The door was slightly open. She was sure she had closed it earlier. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the doorknob and pushed the door open. The room was dark, but moonlight streamed through the window, casting faint shadows over Marcus's desk. She hesitated before stepping inside. Her gaze landed on the stack of case files Marcus had kept from his last investigation. A sick feeling settled in her stomach. Some of the papers were out of place. Had she done that? Or had someone been in here? Before she could think any further, Trooper let out another growl, this time deeper and more urgent. He moved past her, his body stiff as he sniffed the air. Then, he turned sharply toward the window. Valerie's breath caught in her throat. The curtains were slightly parted. She rushed to the window and peered outside, her pulse racing. The yard was empty, at least as far as she could see, but the uneasy feeling didn't go away. For the next few nights, the strange occurrences continued. A chair slightly moved from where she left it. The back door unlocked when she was sure she had locked it. Footsteps outside when no one was there. Trooper's behavior changed too. He became restless, pacing the house, standing guard near Isla's crib, barking at nothing. It wasn't like him to act this way unless there was a reason. Then, at work, something even more unsettling happened. A man Valerie had never seen before walked into the station, asking about Marcus's last case. He was calm, polite, but there was something in his eyes that made her uneasy. She asked his name, but he avoided answering directly. He just wanted information, he said, but when she pressed him, he left without another word. Valerie tried to tell herself it was nothing, that she was overthinking things. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. That night, Valerie woke dog's bark. Trooper's furious barking rang through the house, sharp and nonstop. She sat up, her mind still foggy from sleep, but the urgency in Trooper's voice sent a chill down her spine. Something was wrong. She threw off the covers and rushed to Isla's room. The door was slightly open. Her breath caught as she stepped inside, her eyes scanning the dim space. Her heart nearly stopped when she saw a dark figure standing by the crib, digging through Marcus's old files. A masked intruder. Before Valerie could react, Trooper lunged. The growl that tore from his throat was deep and threatening. The intruder barely had time to turn before Trooper's powerful jaws clamped onto his arm. A muffled shout of pain filled the room as the man struggled, knocking over a small lamp in his attempt to break free. The dim light flickered, casting sharp shadows across the walls. Valerie's hand shook as she grabbed the closest object, a heavy book from Isla's nearby shelf. She didn't think, she just acted, swinging at the intruder with all her strength. It connected with a solid thud, and the man let out a sharp grunt, stumbling back. Trooper didn't let go, his strong body holding the man in place. The intruder kicked out wildly, his foot catching Trooper in the side. The impact made Trooper release his grip for a split second, just enough time for the man to yank himself free. He spun, his face obscured by the dark mask, and bolted for the window. Without hesitation, he threw himself through the opening, crashing onto the lawn below before scrambling into the darkness. Trooper snarled, barking wildly as he leaped onto the windowsill, his muscles tense, ready to chase. But the man was already gone. Valerie's breath came in sharp gasps as she stumbled to the crib. Isla was safe, her tiny face peaceful despite the chaos. Valerie's legs nearly gave out in relief, but she forced herself to stay standing. She grabbed her phone, her fingers shaking as she dialed 911. Her voice was rough, as she gave the operator the details, her pulse still racing. Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the night air. The police arrived quickly, their presence filling the house with movement and voices. Officers searched every inch of the property, but there was no sign of the intruder. No fingerprints. No clear evidence beyond the messy files and Trooper's bloodstained fur where he had bitten a man. Sergeant Paul Grant stood beside her in the living room, his expression serious as he listened to her explain what had happened. "Are you sure you didn't recognize anything about him? His voice, his build?" Valerie shook her head, frustration curling in her chest. "No, he barely made a sound, but he was looking for something. He went straight for Marcus's old case files." Paul frowned, glancing toward the mess of papers still spread across the nursery floor. Whatever he was after, he didn't find it, and he's not going to stop looking. A heavy silence settled between them. The weight of Paul's words pressed against her chest. Nearby, Trooper stood alert, his eyes locked on the door as if expecting the intruder to return. His protective stance, the way he had reacted, everything suddenly became clear to Valerie. She had thought of Trooper as a burden, a constant reminder of what she had lost. But he wasn't. He was a protector. He had been trying to warn her from the start. Valerie reached out, her fingers brushing against Trooper's thick fur. He turned his head slightly, his warm brown eyes meeting hers. For the first time in weeks, she let herself feel the connection, the silent trust between them. She wasn't alone in this. Taking a deep breath, she looked back at Paul. "I want to know what Marcus was working on before he died. Whatever it was, it's the reason that man was here." Paul studied her for a moment before nodding. "We'll figure this out." As the officers continued their search, Valerie sat down beside Trooper, running her fingers through his fur. She had spent so long pushing him away, drowning in her grief. But tonight, he had saved them, and she wasn't going to ignore that anymore. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the blinds, but Valerie hardly noticed. Sleep had been impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the masked intruder standing over Isla's crib. The memory sent a fresh wave of unease through her. She sat at the kitchen table, Marcus's old file spread before her, each paper a thread leading back to a past she didn't fully understand. Trooper sat by her feet, his ears twitching at every small sound. He had barely left her side since the attack, his watchful eyes scanning the room, as if expecting another intruder to appear. Valerie reached down, running a hand through his fur, drawing strength from his steady presence. Determined, she turned her attention to the files. Marcus had been meticulous, keeping notes on every case he worked. But one case, in particular, had been pulled apart. Pages missing, scribbled notes nearly illegible. As she sifted through the papers, Trooper suddenly stood, his tail stiff, his nose twitching. He moved toward a stack of Marcus's old belongings in the corner, sniffing at a wooden chest she hadn't paid much attention to before. Curious, Valerie walked over and knelt beside the chest. It was locked. Trooper let out a low sound, pressing his nose against the lid, insistent. Valerie's heart quickened. If Marcus had hidden something here, it had to be important. She searched through the drawers until she found a small key tucked inside an old envelope. Her hands were unsteady as she slid the key into the lock. With a quiet click, the chest opened. Inside, among old photographs and personal keepsakes, was a USB drive. Valerie swallowed hard. This was it. She rushed to the laptop, plugged in the drive, and waited. A single folder appeared on the screen. She clicked it open, revealing a series of audio recordings, scanned documents, and Marcus's handwritten notes. She pressed play on the first recording. "This is Detective Marcus Reed. Date, February 14th. Case file, unofficial. What I've uncovered so far suggests a pattern, but I don't have enough proof yet. Lieutenant Conrad Steele is involved, but I need more." Valerie's stomach turned. Steele was a high-ranking officer, someone Marcus had worked with, someone she had trusted. She opened another file, reading Marcus's notes aloud to herself. Steele has been covering up crimes, disposing of evidence, silencing witnesses. There are payoffs, threats. He's in deep. A cold dread settled over her. This wasn't just any case. This was something Marcus had been investigating in secret, something dangerous enough to get him killed. She clicked on another audio file. Marcus's voice was lower, urgent. "I'm getting too close. If something happens to me, this drive has everything. Val, if you find this, don't trust anyone, especially not Steele. Her breath caught in her throat. Marcus had known. He had seen it coming. Tears burned at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away. There was no time for grief. This wasn't just about Marcus anymore. It was about Isla, about keeping her safe. Trooper let out a quiet sound, drawing her attention. He was standing by the door, alert. Valerie's pulse quickened. Someone was coming. She pulled the USB from the laptop and shoved it into her pocket just as a knock sounded at the front door. Forcing herself to stay calm, she walked over and peeked through the peephole. It was Sergeant Paul Grant. Relief and caution warred within her. She opened the door slowly. "Hey," Paul greeted, his expression unreadable. "I want to check in after last night. See how you're holding up." Valerie nodded, stepping aside to let him in. "I found something," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Something Marcus left behind." Paul's gaze sharpened. "What is it?" She hesitated, then pulled the USB from her pocket and placed it on the table. "Proof that Marcus's death wasn't an accident. He was murdered." Paul exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "Val, you realize what this means?" "I do." Silence stretched between them. Finally, Paul nodded. "Then we need to be careful. If Steele knows you have this, you're in danger." Valerie looked down at Trooper, who remained tense, ready. She reached out, stroking his fur, grounding herself. "I'm not backing down," she said firmly. "I need to finish what Marcus started." Paul's jaw tightened, but then he nodded. "Then we do this the right way. Together." Valerie took a deep breath. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't just surviving. She was fighting back. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room as Valerie sat at her desk, gripping her phone. The weight of what she had discovered pressed heavily on her chest. She had spent the morning trying to report the evidence she found on Marcus's USB drive. But instead of action, she had been met with resistance. A voice on the other end of the line, flat and impersonal, had warned her in no uncertain terms to leave it alone. Her grip on the phone tightened as she reread the text message she received moments later. "Forget what you found. This isn't your fight." Her breath came slow and steady, but inside, rage simmered beneath the surface. They wanted her back down, to walk away just like that. But she wasn't about to. Trooper sat near the door, his body still, ears alert. He could sense the shift in the air, the tension in her frame. Valerie pushed away from the desk and ran a hand over his back. He leaned in her touch, a silent promise of protection. She knew what she had to do. If they were watching her, if they were afraid of what she had, that meant someone would come for it. And when they did, she would be ready. The hours dragged on. Valerie positioned security cameras at key entry points, ensuring every corner of the house was covered. She tested each angle on her laptop, watching as the feed displayed real-time footage of the front and back doors, the windows, and the hallway leading to Isla's room. The image of the masked intruder from the night before was still burned into her mind, but this time, she wasn't going to be caught off guard. She reached for her revolver, checking the chamber before setting it within arm's reach on the table. Then she knelt beside Trooper, pressing her forehead against his for a moment. "We're ready," she whispered. Night settled in, cloaking the house in silence. Valerie sat in the living room, lights off, her pulse steady. Trooper lay at her feet, his breathing deep but alert. Every sound in the house became amplified. The wind outside, the faint creak of the floorboards as she shifted in her chair. Then, just past midnight, a faint rustling outside the back door sent a chill down her spine. Trooper lifted his head, his body tensed. Valerie remained still, listening. Another sound, this time the soft scrape of something against the lock. She reached for her revolver, her fingers curling around the grip. The door handle twisted slowly. Valerie's heartbeat remained steady as she positioned herself, her back against the wall, waiting. The door burst open, and the masked figure stepped inside. He moved with purpose, heading straight for the desk where her laptop sat. His mistake. Before he could reach it, Valerie switched on the overhead light and raised her weapon. "Stop right there." The intruder froze, shoulders tensing. Trooper sprang forward, a deep growl vibrating through the room. The man lunged toward the desk, and Valerie fired a warning shot into the floorboards. "Don't move," she ordered, her voice sharp. But he ignored her, spinning toward her instead. Before he could take another step, Trooper launched himself forward, his powerful frame knocking the man to the ground. The struggle was immediate, kicking, thrashing, but Trooper was faster, stronger. Teeth clamped down on fabric and flesh, and the man cried out, his movements turning frantic. Valerie approached cautiously, keeping her weapon trained on him. "Let me see your face," she demanded. Trooper held firm, his growl low and unyielding as she reached forward and yanked away the mask. Recognition hit her like a punch to the gut. She knew this man. He wasn't some random thug. He worked under Steele. Her stomach churned, but she pushed it aside. There was no doubt now. Marcus had been murdered, and Steele was behind it. The man groaned, trying to shift under Trooper's weight, but Valerie stepped closer. "You came back for the drive, didn't you?" He refused to speak, his face twisted in pain. She nodded slowly, lips pressing together. "Tell Steele I'm not going anywhere." The man glared at her, but Valerie wasn't shaken. She had made her decision. This fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The intruder sat in the interrogation room, his face tense, hands gripping the edge of the table. Valerie stood on the other side of the glass, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. Paul stepped inside, dropping a folder onto the table. "You've got one chance to come clean." "Who sent you?" he asked, his tone steady but firm. The man hesitated, eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape he wouldn't find. A long breath later, his shoulders dropped. "Steele," he said. "It was Steele. He ordered Marcus's murder. And he's not the only one. There are others, officers on the inside, cleaning up his messes, making sure no one talks." A cold sensation settled in Valerie's stomach. She had known Steele was behind Marcus's death, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way she wasn't ready for. "Names," Paul demanded. "Who else?" The intruder swallowed hard, avoiding his eyes. "It won't matter. If you go after him, you won't make it out alive." Paul leaned in, his voice quiet but firm. "That's not your concern. Give me the names." Minutes later, Valerie stood in the hallway, gripping her phone. She had the confession. She had Marcus's files. She had everything she needed. "We need to move fast," Paul said, stepping beside her. "The longer we wait, the more time Steele has to bury this." Valerie gave a small nod. "I know who to call. Someone outside Steele's reach." Hours later, the weight of corruption came crashing down. Officers stormed Steele's office, arresting him on the spot. His eyes locked onto Valerie as they led him away, his usual arrogance slipping into something darker. "You think this ends with me?" he said. "You have no idea what you started." She met his gaze, unflinching. "Neither do you." With Steele behind bars and his network of officers exposed, Valerie finally allowed herself to breathe. Justice had been served. Marcus's fight hadn't been for nothing. That evening, she sat on the porch, Isla asleep inside, the night air crisp against her skin. Trooper lay beside her, his presence steady and sure. She reached down, running her fingers through his fur. "You never left his side," she whispered, "and you never left mine." Trooper lifted his head, his deep eyes filled with something she couldn't quite name. Loyalty, understanding, family. She had spent so long seeing him as a reminder of what she lost. But now, she saw him for what he truly was, what he had always been. Not just Marcus's partner, not just a protector, but theirs, hers, Isla's. She exhaled, feeling lighter than she had in months. "Come on, Trooper," she said, standing up. "Let's go home." As they stepped inside, the door closing behind them, Valerie knew one thing for certain. No matter what lay ahead, they would face it together. Stronger, unbreakable, a family.